Hello and welcome to the Museum of the United States Air Force here in Dayton, Ohio, and this is one of the most incredible museums in the world. Highlights included the only B-2 Spirit, the XB-70, the YF-12, the only F-22 Raptor on display, and many others. And in this video I'm going to take you on a detailed tour of the entire place. Now if there's a specific aircraft that you're looking for, then I'm going to leave details of that aircraft in the video description below or on the timestamps, so just click on one of those. Otherwise, sit back and enjoy the show. This is part one of a two-part series of videos. In this one, we'll be starting with the early years, including the first ever military aircraft, the Wright military flyer. We will then look at aircraft from World War I before moving into World War II, including Boxcar, the actual B-29 that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki. Then we'll move into the jet age with the Korean War section and watch these jets evolve as we explore aircraft from the Southeast Asia War. Then in the second video, we will look at the incredible range of aircraft from the Cold War, including the B-2 stealth bomber, the massive B-36, XB-70 and the SR-71 Blackbird. Following that, we'll look at JFK's Air Force One, top secret spy Gemini space capsules, the YF-23 stealth fighter prototype and an actual flying saucer. Now the lighting was a problem in the first part of the video, so I've done the best I can and I can assure you that it does improve as the video moves along. Starting with Genesis, the first aircraft flown by the US military, the 1909 Wright military flyer, and designated as Signal Corps Airplane No. 1. By the way, here's the original fabric from the actual first Wright flyer that introduced the world to heavier than air flight in 1903. It's a replica made in 1995, while the original is in Washington DC and its role was primarily reconnaissance. It was powered by a 4-cylinder 30 horsepower engine with a max speed of 42 miles per hour and a maximum flight time of 60 minutes. In September 17, 1908, this aircraft was involved in the first airplane death when a propeller failed, resulting in a crash. Orville Wright was injured, although the passenger, Lieutenant Selfridge, was killed. Here's a fragment of that very propeller blade. This is a French SPAD biplane and first flew in 1917 and operated by the French, the British and the United States Army Air Service, with over 8,400 being built. It was powered by a 220 brake horsepower V8 and had two 303 cal Vickers machine guns mounted above the engine. This is a Kettering aerial torpedo invented in 1917 and a forerunner of the cruise missile. It was launched from a four-wheeled dolly running along the track and stabilized by onboard electric and pneumatic controls with preset instructions. After a set time, the engine cut off and the wings released, resulting in it crashing to the ground and exploding. It could hit targets 75 miles away, although it was never used in combat. This huge aircraft here is an Italian built, although it was also assembled in France, Great Britain and the USA. It's a Caproni Ca.36 bomber, and this design first flew in 1916. It was powered by three inline-six water-cooled engines producing 150 horsepower with two props forward of the wings and one behind the fuselage in a pusher configuration. Tyre technology was very primitive at the time, so they put four wheels on each strut and two at the nose. It was actually extremely advanced with a tricycle layout, as most aircraft went with a tail dragger design before reverting back to the tricycle, which is what we all use now. At the front was the forward gunner manning a 6.5 or 77mm machine gun, and behind them were two pilots and another gunner in a cage to ensure that they weren't sucked into the large central propeller. It could also carry up to 1,700 pounds of bombs. It had a top speed of 87 miles per hour with a range of 372 miles and could fly up to just under 15,000 feet. Another advance at the time was the three fins, which allowed it to have three smaller fins instead of a large and single tall fin that would require a much taller hangar. This is the Martin MB-2, which was the first American-designed bomber produced in large numbers. These were ordered in 1920 to replace the British Handley Page and Italian Caproni bombers such as the one you just saw. There's no originals of these left, and this is the only full-scale reproduction anywhere in the world. They were powered by two Liberty V12 engines producing around 420 horsepower each and had a top speed of 99 miles per hour with a range of around 400 miles. These were used in Project B, which was a demonstration bombing of naval ships. Brigadier General Billy Mitchell was concerned about all the spending on the Navy and believed that a much cheaper fleet of aircraft could do a better job of defending the coastline. The Navy were obviously unhappy with this and even tried to get him sacked before the test, but in the end 6 of these bombers were used to sink a captured German battleship with 2,000-pound bombs stored underneath the fuselage, showing the advantage of the planes over ships. These had the added benefit of folded wings, which allowed it to fit inside hangars which would otherwise be too small. Again, the lighting was difficult, so apologies for some of the image quality, and I will jump ahead. Again, the lighting gets better as we progress through the museum. Next up is the World War II section. Straight ahead is the Curtiss P-36A Hawk, first produced in 1938. The US Air Corps obtained 243 P-36s, including some seized export models after the Germans invaded Norway. While sturdy, it couldn't keep up with the German Bf109 and was relegated to a training role. This actual aircraft on display was the first ever example delivered to the Air Corps. Next is the Seversky P-35 fighter, which was the first in the US Army Air Corps fighter to have a retractable landing gear, all metal construction and an enclosed cockpit. It first flew in 1935 and introduced in 1937. It was also the only American aircraft used operationally by the Japanese during World War II, who ordered 22-seater versions before they became hostile to the USA. This is the Douglas B-18 Bolo, a heavy bomber used by the US and Canadians in the late 1930s and early 1940s. It was developed from the passenger DC-3 airliner and C-47 cargo plane, you'll see it later. It was slow, carried a small bomb load, and had inadequate defensive armament for the 1940s and was replaced by the B-17. Then it was used as a transporter and in an anti-submarine role. In fact, it was the first American aircraft to sink a German U-boat. Next is a fighter, the Curtiss P-40E Warhawk, which was a modification of the P-36 that you saw a minute ago, and considered to be the best US fighter by the start of World War II. Introduced in 1939, this was used to defend Pearl Harbor and in the Philippines in 1941. It was also used by the Flying Tigers in China, and you'll see one of those aircraft in my Museum of Flight video I filmed in Seattle. It probably wasn't as fast or as nimble as some of the newer enemy fighters, but extremely rugged, and over 13,000 were built. This is a North American B-25 Mitchell medium bomber and made famous for the Doolittle raids in Tokyo in 1941. In response to the Pearl Harbor attacks, these were launched off aircraft carriers to bomb the Japanese mainland and then land in friendly China. While the physical damage wasn't a lot, it was a huge morale boost for the Americans. Just under 10,000 of these were built and used by many nations, including the Soviets and Indonesia, the latter of who retired theirs in 1979. It was one of these that accidentally flew into the Empire State Building in New York City during thick fog in 1945, sadly killing 14. It had an interesting tail section with 2 fins, which had the benefit of providing redundancy if one of them was damaged, and they are located directly behind the props, improving their authority. And again, it also allowed for a smaller tail, thus allowing it to fit in small hangars. Next is the Belle P-39 Airacobra, which was a fighter and the first to be fitted with a tricycle undercarriage. Its engine placement was unique, and it was behind the pilot with a prop shaft running between the pilot's feet to the front. The reason for this was to allow space for a 37mm cannon firing directly through the center of the prop hub to improve accuracy. There were also 50 cal machine guns as well. The engine placement also allowed for a much more streamlined and aerodynamic nose. Interestingly, it was a layout rarely used by anyone else, and just under 10,000 of them were built, including 4,000 by the Soviets. The Germans had a lot of success with dive bombers in Poland and France, so the US Army ordered the US Navy Douglas SPAD-S.XIIIs, which were redesignated the A-24. They removed the tailhook used for carrier landings, and these could carry 2,250 pounds of bombs. Their performance was average, and they were later used as trainers and to tow targets. This display here recognizes Charles Alfred Anderson, who was the first African American to earn a commercial pilot's license. From 1941, he worked as a flight trainer for the US Army Air Corps, and the same year he famously took First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt for a joy flight. This is a British Bristol Beaufighter, and this actual aircraft was flown by the Royal Australian Air Force, but was then repainted in American markings. This was highly successful as a night fighter because of its large size, allowed it to carry heavy armament, and also early radars without major modifications. It entered service just before the German Blitz, and it accounted for over half of the Luftwaffe bombers shot down during the nighttime raids on London. The purpose-built American P-61 Black Widow night fighters began to replace these in December 1944, although these continued to fly for Allied forces in Italy and France until the end of the war. This is a Consolidated B-24D introduced in 1941. Armed with 10 50 cal machine guns and a bomb load of 8,000 pounds, this 4-engine heavy bomber had a highly efficient shoulder-mounted wing providing a high cruise speed and a long range, although the handling was average. They actually considered using one of these as the dedicated presidential plane, but the Secret Service expressed concerns about its safety, so they used a DC-4 instead, and I'll show you that very aircraft called the Sacred Cow later in this video. Sitting here is the Italian Macchi C-200 flown by the Italian Air Force during World War II. They performed reasonably well and against US forces in Africa and Italy. This example was abandoned in Benghazi airfield and put on display in the USA to sell war bonds to the general public. Back talking about bombers again, and we'll spin around and have a look at the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. This and the B-24 formed the backbone of the American Strategic Bombing Force, which helped win the war by crippling the German war industry. The aircraft here is the famous Memphis Belle, which was the first heavy bomber that returned to the US after flying 25 missions over Europe. Sadly, it was rare to survive so many missions. It had a unique design, and having some of the main tyres sitting below the fuselage so that less damage would be done during a belly landing. It was powered by a Wright R1820 turbo supercharged radial engines, and that turbocharger was on display from below. From below, we can also look up into the bomb bay, and what's striking is how small it actually is inside. In another video, I actually crawl inside one of these and a B-29, so it's fascinating to compare them, so check out those videos on my channel. Under here, you've got a small ball turret, and it's incredible to think that a brave man would sit inside this. The later B-29 had remote control turrets, but this required someone to physically sit inside it. Looking down here, and we have a Norden bomb sight, which was a top secret device that measured the aircraft's ground speed and direction and continuously recalculated the bomb's impact point based on changing flight conditions. These improved accuracy dramatically. A lot of effort was put into keeping these out of Nazi spies' hands, although apparently the Germans actually got their hands on one fairly early in the war. We have here a North American A-36A Mustang, which was the ground attack version of the P-51 Mustang, with the main distinguishing feature being their rectangular dive brakes above and below the wings. They were armed with 6 50 cal AN/M2 Browning machine guns and 2 underwing hardpoints for bombs weighing up to 1,000 pounds. Next is the Supermarine Mk5. The Mark III was under development, but quite a major upgrade with an improved wing, retractable tailwheel, and new engines, therefore it was taking too long. The arrival of the BF109E highlighted the Spitfire's high altitude deficiencies, so they quickly developed the Mark V and rushed it into production. It was essentially a Mark II, but with Merlin 45 engines that were modified to specifically improve high altitude performance. This C model was also available with 4 20mm cannons and 4 .303 machine guns. Here we are looking back at the Liberator and the rear side gunner's position, and as you can see, it was just a simple hole in the fuselage. There was no cabin pressurization. It would have been extremely cold at altitude, and they'd rely on oxygen masks as well. In fact, the crew would have had heating jackets using electricity to keep them warm, but early designs would short on their sweat, which wasn't comfortable. There was also a tail gunner sitting between the 2 vertical fins. Other than the existential anguish of knowing that you could be blown out of the skies at any second, these were extremely uncomfortable planes to fly in, This is a famous P-51D Mustang, which was one of the best known fighters of World War II and a great example of Anglo-American design. The aircraft itself was great, but the Allison engine limited it, so they installed the British Rolls-Royce Merlins, and the performance improvement was instant and dramatic. At 30,000 feet, it was flying around 100 miles an hour faster than the Allison-powered P-51. Over 15,000 of these were built. This is the Lockheed P-38 Lightning, and it was a single-seat, twin-engine fighter. Moving the engines to the side allowed space for cannons and guns in addition to the rockets and bombs. It also allowed for the installation of a radar, allowing it to operate as a night fighter. It could also have drop tanks attached, as you can see on this example, and used in a long-range bomber escort role, and over 10,000 of these were built. Now, I've mentioned this before, and it's the Messerschmitt BF109, a really impressive German fighter which formed a backbone of the German fighter force with the FW190, which you'll see shortly. It first flew in 1935 and came with a retractable landing gear, automatic slats, an enclosed cockpit, cantilever wings, and a stressed skin construction, which was impressive for the time. While its high altitude performance was impressive, its range was not. In fact, it couldn't escort Luftwaffe bombers past London, leaving central and western UK safe from German attack. Over 34,000 of these were built and retired by the Spanish Air Force in 1965. Back on the Allied side, and we have the Martin B-26G Marauder medium bomber. It first flew in 1940, although the Air Corps was so optimistic they ordered 1,000 of them 2 months prior. It had the lowest loss rate of any Allied bomber, even though it flew over 110,000 sorties. Just below it is a Mark 13 aerial torpedo, and these were attached to modified B-26s to attack Japanese aircraft carriers during the Battle of Midway. Sadly, only 2 of the 4 B-26s returned, and none of the torpedoes hit the Japanese ships. As you can see, these were well armoured with 11 50 cal M2 Browning machine guns and could carry up to 4,000 pounds of bombs. Next is the Douglas C-47 transport plane based off the highly successful DC-3 airliner. This incredibly durable design first flew in 1941, and some remain in service to this day. Over 10,000 were produced, over 100 countries' armed forces flew these, and over 60 variants of these were built. It was powered by trusty Pratt & Whitney R1830 twin Wasp radial engines, although some of these have been more recently upgraded to more efficient turboprops. Underneath its massive wing is not a German V-1 flying bomb, but a Republic Ford JB-2 Loon. This was a US-built copy, somewhat reverse-engineered from the V-1s found in Europe. Production began in 1945, and some were loaded onto ships in preparation for the planned invasion of Japan, which thankfully never eventuated. This rather sinister-looking rocket here is the V-2, and this was the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. This was also the first artificial object to reach space, crossing the Kármán line at an altitude of 330,000 feet. These were far more terrifying than the V-1 because they flew at supersonic speed, and there was no audible warning until there was a massive explosion. This twin-engine German bomber is a Junker Ju-88D and one of the most versatile airplanes of World War II. It was a day and night interceptor, a bomber, a dive bomber, an unpiloted missile, and a reconnaissance aircraft from its first flight in 1936. This was a reconnaissance version with a unique light blue paint underneath to help it blend in with the sky, and a green top half to blend in with the ground for enemy fighters looking from above. 15,000 were built, and it had a crew of 4. Below it is a Fritz 10 3,450-pound guided bomb that could be dropped from 20,000 feet and penetrate 28 inches of armour. Aided by flares, the bombardier could send radio signals to move the rear control surfaces to direct it towards the target. Later models had a wire guide to prevent jamming, and this was first used in 1943. It famously sunk the Italian battleship Roma, but otherwise the accuracy still wasn't great. This little fella back here is a Messerschmitt Me-163B Komet, and the only rocket-powered fighter in history and the first piloted aircraft to exceed 1,000 km an hour or 620 miles an hour in level flight. The rocket engine provided an excellent climb rate, but the range was severely limited by high fuel consumption, and the fuel itself was hazardous and sometimes exploded without reason, killing the pilot. 279 of these were delivered, and the single operational group had 9 successful kills, but lost 14 of their own aircraft. This is a Me-262 and the world's first operational turbojet aircraft. It first flew in 1942 and was considerably faster than any propeller-driven airplane. Over 1,400 of these were built, although only less than 300 saw combat, due to Allied bombings resulting in a shortage of fuel. As this was very thirsty, there were no spare parts, and there was also a shortage of pilots. Lots of these pilots struggled with the conversion to jet engines, which would throttle up much slower than the regular piston engine. In fact, I believe that the B-47 took over 18 seconds to spool up from idle to full military throttle. Stepping back a generation is the Fokker-Wulf Fw190 fighter aircraft that was introduced in 1941, and with the BF109 you saw earlier, made up the backbone of the Luftwaffe fighting force. Over 20,000 of these were built. Next to it is a Spitfire PR-11 reconnaissance version with the guns and armour removed and replaced with cameras, a more powerful engine and a larger oil tank. Next to this is a British de Havilland DH-98 Mosquito, which was powered by 2 of the Spitfire's Rolls-Royce Merlin engines. In fact, these engines were shared with many aircraft that helped with the spare parts and maintenance. These aircraft were constructed mostly of wood and were extremely fast and had a long range. The US Army Air Force used them in photographic and weather reconnaissance roles, as well as a night fighter. Walking past the FW190 again, we have the Curtiss C-46 Commando, which was a low-wing cargo plane built on the pressurized CW-20 airliner, although none of the cargo versions were pressurized themselves. Deliveries began in 1942 and over 3,100 were delivered. These carried more cargo and had better high-altitude performance than the C-47s, so were used to transport war materials over the Himalayas. The problem was that they were highly maintenance intensive and there was a relatively high loss rate. After the war, many C-47s were used in civilian roles, although its poor fuel consumption and maintenance costs, up to 50% more than the Douglas, a DC-3 or C-47s, limited their utility. On the side here, you can see the large cargo door. As you will see later in the video, cargo aircraft move their doors to either the nose or the tail, allowing easier movement onto and out of the cargo hold. But this would obviously require far more complex engineering. This is a Douglas A-20 Havoc medium bomber, and also flown as an attack aircraft, a night fighter and a recon aircraft. Over 7,000 were built, and they were especially known for creating havoc with low-level attacks against Japanese shipping and airports with those 6 nose-mounted 50 cal machine guns and 4,000-pound bomb loads. They were powered by 2 Wright R-2600s, shared with the Grumman Avenger, the B-29 Mitchell and many other aircraft. This is a significant aircraft, the B-29 Superfortress called Boxcar, which was the actual aircraft that dropped the atomic bomb on Nagasaki in August 9, 1945. The B-29 itself was the most expensive single project of World War II and was designed to replace the B-17 and the B-24. It was a huge upgrade with a pressurized interior, but they would actually depressurize over a combat zone so that a small shrapnel wound wouldn't cause a quick and sudden pressure differential that would break the whole aircraft apart. It also had an advanced remote control turret system where multiple guns could be controlled by the same person from within the fuselage and wouldn't require someone to sit inside the actual turret itself, like we saw on the B-17 earlier. This yellow replica bomb here is the Fat Man dropped by this aircraft. It weighed 10,000 pounds and detonated at an altitude of 1,800 feet with a yield of 20,000 tons of TNT. This green one here is a replica of the actual Little Boy bomb from Hiroshima, and while it was much smaller than the Fat Man, it only weighed around 1,000 pounds less. Next we have the consolidated A-20 Catalina, which was the US Army Air Force's version of the PBY flown by the Navy. It's an amphibious aircraft with retractable wheels and wingtip floats. These were used primarily in a rescue role and continue to be used in an aerial firefighting role to this day. This aircraft took part in the Australian double sunrise flights, when the Japanese cut off the Australian connection with Great Britain through Singapore. These would fly non-stop from Western Australia to Sri Lanka in a flight taking between 27 and 33 hours non-stop, hence why they would see 2 sunrises. They were so full of fuel at the beginning that they would fly at several hundred feet initially before losing weight and being able to gain altitude. This black plane here is a Northrop P-61C Black Widow, and the first aircraft designed as a night fighter from the start. The radar in that nose allowed the crew of 2 or 3 to locate enemy aircraft in total darkness and replace the British Beaufighter that you saw earlier. These had 4 50 cal machine guns in the upper turret and 4 20mm cannons in the belly. This orange thing here is a Japanese trainer kamikaze rocket bomb. These would be carried during training flights and then released, allowing the pilots to control their aiming. These were fitted with landing skids and flaps. Next, let's move forward into the Korean War gallery. Slightly out of sync, but I can't complain, as this is the only F-22 Raptor on display anywhere in the world that was actually a flying example initially. First is the engine, the YF119 augmented turbofan, which produces 35,000 pounds of thrust and capable of supercruise, which is supersonic flight without the need for an afterburner. It also had thrust vectoring, where the angle of the engine could be moved up or down a few degrees to improve maneuverability. This F-22A used 2 of them and was one of 9 prototypes and retired to the museum in 2007 after the testing process was complete. The USAF announced the need for a new fighter that took advantage of the latest technologies, including advanced composites and flight control systems, high-power engines, and stealth technology. Lockheed Martin, who won the contract, submitted their YF-22, while Northrop entered with their YF-23, which I'll show you later in this video. Looking up is the Boeing Bird of Prey stealth technology demonstrator, which was hard to see because it was attached to the roof. This top secret program ran from 1992 until 1999. Maybe we'll get a closer look at this in the future when it's displayed on the ground. Jumping a long way back in time, we have the Lockheed F-80C Shooting Star. While this was not the first American jet, because we'll see that later in the video, it was the first one put into mass production and the first to exceed 500 miles per hour in level flight. It made its maiden flight in 1944, and while some were shipped to Europe, it wasn't used in a combat role before World War II ended. It had a much larger role in the Korean War, where it was involved in the first all-jet fighter-air battle with a MiG-15 and won in 1950. But the straight-wing design did hamper its speed in contrast with the Soviet MiG-15 and was eventually replaced by the F-86. A modified version, the T-33, went on to be a highly successful trainer. And speaking of those 2 jets, here's the North American F-86A Sabre. This was the first USAF jet with swept wings and set a world speed record in 1948 of 670.9 miles per hour. In fact, one did break the sound barrier, although only in a dive, therefore it wasn't officially supersonic. Over 5,500 of these were built. Now some might debate the point, but the Aussies will argue that they perfected the design with the CAC Sabre, where they installed a British Rolls-Royce Avon jet engine, which was considerably more powerful than the Allison J33 in the original Sabre. These had a kill ratio of 8-to-1 with the MiG-15. It's interesting to compare the design with the MiG-15 next to it. Both have nose-positioned air intakes, but while the F-86 has the air travel straight down a tunnel to the engine and the cockpit sits on top of it, the MiG-15 diverts the air to the side and around the cockpit, which sits much lower. This means that the MiG has a lower frontal area, thus reducing drag, although the F-86 has better visibility, as the seat is sticking up in the air. This jet surprised the Americans and led to the rapid F-86 development, as this was outclassing the likes of the F-80 that we saw a minute ago. Of interest, this actual aircraft was flown by a North Korean defector to the Kimpo Air Base in South Korea in September 1953. After looking over it in fine detail and flying it, the Americans offered to give it back to the Soviets, but they declined, so it was sent to the museum for display. This might look out of place in the Korean War section, but it is a North American F-82G twin Mustang. These were the last American piston-engine fighters ordered by the Air Force and were meant to be long-range escort fighters for the B-29 Super Fortresses, but they arrived too late. They were introduced in 1946 and were the first American aircraft to operate over Korea. In fact, the first 3 North Korean air losses were shot down by F-82s. The crew of 2 consisted of a pilot and a co-pilot navigator to avoid fatigue on the long flights. It was essentially 2 P-51H Mustangs with a lengthened fuselage with more fuel and equipment. A center wing and an outer wings were reinforced to allow the addition of hardpoints for more fuel and bombs. Larger tail fins were installed to help with lateral movements in the case of an engine failure. Next we have a Douglas B-26C, which was originally designated the A-26 Invader, and this was a light bomber and ground attack aircraft used in World War II from 1942. It saw service during the Korean War in an interdiction role where it would attack enemy supply lines and was often escorted by twin Mustangs that you saw just before. But with the arrival of the MiG-15, these were limited to night flying only. These returned to action in the early stages of the Vietnam War as well, and over 2,500 were built. Spinning around, and we have the Republic F-84E Thunderjet, which was the second American jet fighter to enter large-scale production, and it first flew in 1946. Early models had problems with weak wing spars, excessive weight, and engine and spare parts shortages, although most of the problems were ironed out by the E model that you see here. While sturdy, the straight wing was inferior to the MiG-15's swept wing, therefore the wing was changed with later Thunderstreak and Thunderflash models. Significantly, this was the first production fighter with in-flight refueling and was capable of carrying a nuclear weapon, the small Mark 7 bomb. They were also modified to dock with B-29 and B-36 motherships in flight so that they could serve as an escort role and sit inside the bomb bay and be released when the enemy arrived. There was even the XF-84 Thunderscreech turboprop version, which you'll see later in the video. These were initially planned to escort B-29s on long-range missions over North Korea, although they were also great in close air support roles and daytime interdiction, taking out enemy supply routes and infrastructure. Next we have the Lockheed F-94A Starfire, which was a development of the T-33 trainer, which itself was a development of the F-80 Shooting Star, the first mass-production American fighter jet that you saw earlier. This jet was the first American all-weather jet interceptor and the first US jet to have an afterburner. While the F-80 that we saw earlier had large guns and weapon stores in the nose, this had a large radar and a few guns too. This radar allowed it to locate enemy aircraft in poor weather and or at night. In the Korean War and in defense roles of both Japan and the United States, these replaced the F-82 twin Mustang from a few minutes ago. They were based in Alaska and sat waiting for potential attack from Soviet bombers on the American mainland. There was particular concern about the Soviet Tu-4 strategic bomber, which was a reversed-engineered B-29 Superfortress that had landed in Soviet territory during World War II when they were still a friendly country, hence why this was rushed into production. Looking up, we have the North American B-45C Tornado, which is one of the lesser-known aircraft in the USAF, but actually quite significant. It first flew in 1947 and was the first American 4-engine jet bomber to fly, the first American production jet bomber, and the first multi-jet reconnaissance aircraft to refuel in mid-air. It was in response to the US government's request for a bomber after seeing the German jet Arado AR-234, which by the way, there's only one anywhere in the world and it'll be in my Smithsonian tour video. Unfortunately, being one of the first jet bombers, it struggled especially with poor engine reliability. Of interest, in 1940, it was the victim of the first successful interception of a jet bomber after a MiG-15 shot one down over Chinese airspace. They were used in a reconnaissance role, as well as bombing. In fact, 40 of them were extensively modified to carry nuclear weapons. In the early 1950s, these were the primary nuclear deterrents, before being replaced by the larger B-47 Stratojet and the B-58 Hustler, both of whom you will see soon. This yellow object here is an A-3 lifeboat. Modified B-29 Superfortresses, known as SB-29s, carried these underneath their fuselage, and would fly with the bomber formation and then sit and wait off the coast for the bombers to return, and if any needed to ditch in the water, these would be dropped next to them. They could carry up to 15 people and equipped with food and water. This is a Sikorsky UH-19B, used by all of the US military services. What's especially interesting is the positioning of the 9-cylinder air-cooled radial piston engine forward and below the crew compartment, rather than on top as we see on most choppers. This improved the center of gravity, enabling easier maintenance of balance with different and sometimes rapidly changing loading conditions. It was also easier for engineers to access. In fact, the entire engine could be replaced in just 2 hours. We'll quickly jump into the future again and look at the Northrop Grumman RQ-4 Global Hawk reconnaissance aircraft. It is crewed by 3 humans remotely, with 1 pilot and 2 operating all of the sensors, much of which remains classified. Unlike the ones earlier, this is powered by a Rolls-Royce turbofan jet engine and can fly up to 60,000 feet. Well, that's the official number. And it can fly for up to 34 hours without refueling, which is the longest of any US Air Force jet. Next, we jump back in time again and look at the Douglas C-124 Globemaster II. These were the primary heavy lift aircraft for the USA during the 1950s and 1960s, until the arrival of the jet-powered C-141 that you'll see shortly. These first flew in 1949 and were nicknamed Old Shaky. In addition to being capable of handling tanks, field guns, trucks and bulldozers, it could also carry 200 fully equipped soldiers in a double-decked cabin. Now, sorry about the fairly poor lighting, and here we are coming to the end of the Korean War section. Next up, we'll head off to the Southeast Asia War in Vietnam, Laos and Cambodia. By the way, the script for this video was just over 20,000 words and it took hours to research. If you enjoyed it, then please give it a thumbs up and make a comment. This encourages YouTube to promote the video, which helps the channel so I can film more of these. But let's quickly look at a more modern aircraft that just happened to be filmed first. This is a General Atomics Aeronautical Systems YMQ-8 Reaper and is a remote control aerial vehicle capable of providing live-time reconnaissance through clouds and even at night, and also directly attacking the target with AGM-114 Hellfire missiles, Paveway 2s and JDAMs. It was powered by a 900 horsepower turboprop, propelling it to a top speed of 230 miles per hour and has a range of over 3,600 miles, which was a huge increase over its predecessor, the MQ-1 Predator. It first flew in 2001 and remains in service with the USAF, US Customs and Border Protection, as well as the Italians and the British. Next is the Douglas A-1E Skyraider. Towards the end of World War II, Douglas proposed this to replace the SPD Dauntless, and it first flew in 1945, just as the war ended. Over 3,000 were delivered to the Navy and operate from carriers, and many were used during the Korean War. The Air Force later modified these and redesignated them as the A-1E Skyraider. It could fly for long periods at low altitudes, absorb a lot of ground fire and carry a large amount of bombs, hence the many underwing hardpoints. Therefore it was ideal in a close air support role. It was powered by a Wright R-3350, which also powered the B-29 Super Fortress, Constellation and many others. In fact, over 29,000 of those engines were produced, so spare parts were everywhere. Moving on, we enter the jet age with the North American F-100F Super Sabre. This was a 2-seater training version rushed into production after the high number of crashes which were thought to be due to pilot error. As so happens, the design was compromised, making it incredibly difficult to fly before it was modified. These 2-seater versions still had a combat role with 6 under-wing hardpoints, although they reduced the cannons from 4 to 2. This aircraft was the first used by the USAF that could break the speed of sound in level flight, as you have to remember that the F-86 did so but during a dive, and the aircraft like the Belle X-1 are rockets so they don't count. In 1958, they stuck an Astrodyne booster rocket underneath one of these as a part of the ZLL testing, which stood for Zero Length Launch. The idea was that they wouldn't need a runway and could position these next to important sites where they could be launched to defend almost immediately. Once in the air, they would drop the rocket and use the standard engine, although this never got further than testing. Next is the McDonnell RF-101C Voodoo, which it was a modified reconnaissance version of the F-101 that you'll see shortly. In the nose, you can see forward and side-facing cameras. In fact, at the time, it was the world's first supersonic recon aircraft. This actual aircraft took part in Operation Sun Run in 1957, where it flew low-altitude flights during the Cuban Missile Crisis to help confirm that the missile sites were being dismantled. Above us is the massive B-52D Stratofortress, which is so large that it's difficult to film. In addition to the massive 70,000 pounds of mixed ordnances, they also added more bombs to these underwing pylons. To this day, and with later models, they use these pylons for bombs and missiles and even test aircraft. In fact, the X-15 was dropped from one of these. Next, we have a really interesting aircraft, as it was designed by the British, English Electric specifically, named after the capital city of Australia because the Aussies ordered it, and this one was built in the United States by Martin under license. The English version first flew in 1949, and it was the first jet to fly non-stop across the Atlantic Ocean, and in 1957 established a world altitude record of 70,000 feet, allowing it to fly over enemy interceptors. At the time, the Brits really had an advanced aviation industry. These operated in Vietnam from 1965 until 69, and after that, this aircraft was converted to an electronic countermeasures EB-57B, but returned to its bomber configuration before being put on display here. This is difficult to see, but above is a Cessna A-37 Dragonfly. This was a light attack aircraft based on the T-37 jet trainer, with cockpit armour, more powerful engines, strengthened airframe, and redundant flight controls to allow it to survive ground fire. These replaced the aging prop-driven Douglas A-1 Skyraiders. Here's a Douglas B-26K Counter Invader, which was a modified version of the World War II attack bomber, the A-26 Invader. In the nose were 8 50 cal guns, and there was also 8 wing pylons, in addition to an internal bomb bay. They were used in the Korean War as a night intruder against enemy supply lines before being retired. They were then brought back in 1966 and used for ground attack missions on the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This here is a North American Rockwell OV-10A Bronco, which first flew in 1967. It was a twin turboprop short takeoff and landing aircraft developed under a joint USAF, Navy and Marine Corps program. Its role included reconnaissance, limited ground attack, and forward air control. It also had a rear compartment offering a very small transport capability, including 5 fully equipped soldiers or 2 patients with a medical attendant. They were retired by the US in 1995, although they remain in service with the Philippine Air Force. This is an icon of the Vietnam War, the Belle UH-1P, nicknamed the Huey. Over 16,000 of these were built, and they were the first turbine-powered chopper in the US military. Major roles included general utility and medical evacuation, although gunship versions with rockets and machine guns were later added with more powerful engines that were capable of managing the extra weight. This actual aircraft operated with the 20th Special Operations Squadron flying dangerous and classified missions in Laos and Cambodia. This massive thing, which is difficult to see with the black paint, is a Sikorsky CH-3E. These amphibious transport helicopters were purchased by the Navy first before the Air Force borrowed them and then bought some themselves. Later ones were modified for combat rescue missions with self-sealing fuel tanks, a rescue hoist, armour and in-flight refueling. This one was called Black Maria due to the colour and used in highly classified missions. This good-looking bird is a Fairchild C-123K Provider, which was a short-range assault transporter designed to drop troops and cargo off at small and rough runways near the front line. The prototype first flew in 1949, so it's quite an old design, although it was later upgraded to include 2 J-85 jet engines to improve their performance. This aircraft started as a C-123B without the jet engines, but was later upgraded to the K model with jets and flew low-level defoliant and insecticide spray missions as part of the Operation Ranch Hand. The idea was that they would deprive the Viet Cong of food and vegetation cover, although there remains a lot of controversy due to the negative health effects both on the civilians below but also on the US military personnel who were exposed to it. This aircraft itself was nicknamed Patches because of the many metal patches over it, as it received over 1,000 bullet and shrapnel hits during its low-level flights. This is the de Havilland C-7A Caribou and is a Canadian short takeoff and landing cargo plane used to fly into small and unmaintained airstrips near the front lines. I've seen these flight air shows and it's incredible how quickly they can come to a stop after touching down. It first flew in 1958 and was incredibly durable. In fact, it wasn't retired by the Royal Australian Air Force until 2009 and some remain airworthy. They could carry 26 fully equipped soldiers, 20 patients or 3 tons of equipment. These were powered by 2 Pratt & Whitney R2000 engines shared with the DC-4 and military C-54, although later models were fitted with turboprops amongst other changes resulting in the DHC-5 Buffalo. It's really interesting to see the opposing side's aircraft, and here is a MiG-17F. This was a replacement for the revolutionary MiG-15 with a longer fuselage, afterburner and a sharper wing sweep, resulting in a higher speed and better handling. It first flew in 1950 and was used by many nations including the North Vietnamese from 1964. While these were more maneuverable than the American jets, they were slower. This aircraft was a gift from the Egyptian Air Force and repainted in the North Vietnamese Air Force colours. One issue with the swept wing was the tendency for the air to move sideways and cause the wing to stall. Therefore, these are fitted with especially large wing fences which force the air to move straight over them. Then moving across, we have the replacement, the famous MiG-21, which Allied countries nicknamed Fishbed. The nose particularly was an evolutionary design with a front-mounted air intake, but a movable central cone was added to create a shockwave to slow the incoming air and also create room for a radar system. This design did allow for a much narrower fuselage, hence the high top speed for a single engine, although it only allowed for a small radar. Later Soviet jets, and Americans after the F-100 Super Sabre, moved the air intakes to the sides to keep the whole nose free for ever increasingly large radars and also guns. These first flew in 1955 and over 10,000 were built in the USSR, 840 in India, and more built under license in China as the Chengdu J7, which was built up until 2013. These were more nimble than the bigger twin-engine F-4 Phantom IIs and almost as fast, and they managed to take down around 50 American aircraft, although 68 MiG-21s were shot down on the North Vietnamese side. Moving further around, we have the Douglas A-1H Skyraider. We saw one of these earlier. Well, it was an E model. Introduced right at the end of World War II, these saw service in Korea and Vietnam even with the arrival of jets. While slower, they had a vastly superior fuel economy, therefore these could be used in a search and rescue mission, where they would find the downed airmen and then loiter using their massive amounts of weaponry, which you can see attached in underwing pylons, to keep the enemy away until the helicopters could arrive and rescue the crew. And speaking of jets, here's a Republic F-105D, which is one of the Century series of jets, all of which you'll see in this video. This one was named Memphis Belle II, after the B-17 from World War II, and of interest, this could actually carry a larger bomb load than the B-17, even though it was a fighter designed to replace the F-86 Sabre. This was a supersonic tactical fighter bomber, and actually the largest single-seat and single-engine jet aircraft when it entered service. Interestingly, it was initially designed as a high-speed penetration aircraft and would carry a nuclear bomb, although that role did change during the development process, and it became a primary attack aircraft during the early stages of the Vietnam War. Moving on, and we have the Lockheed EC-121D Constellation, which was a heavily modified C-121 Constellation. Using the huge radomes above and below the fuselage, these tracked enemy aircraft. In fact, in 1967, over the Gulf of Tonkin, it guided a fighter to destroy a MiG-21, which was the first time a weapons controller in an airborne radar had ever successfully destroyed an enemy plane. These also directed American planes to the aerial refuelers and guided rescue planes to down crews. Apologies for my lighting, as my camera's light did go flat. As with all the Connies, it had a beautiful triple tail design. It was powered by 4 Wright R3350s, and I'd encourage you to check out my Super Connie flying footage for some incredible sights and sounds, and I'll link to that video in the description below with all the other videos I'll mention. Next up is the famous McDonnell Douglas F-4 Phantom II. It was first flown in 1958 and meant to be one of the first without an onboard gun, although they later realised one was needed and it was added. These had a crew of 2, and that large nose was filled with an advanced radar that could be operated by the second crew member. I mentioned before that the F-105 could carry more than the B-17, while this jet could double its bomb load. These could also carry drop fuel tanks in addition to electronic countermeasure pods that would detect incoming missiles and blast them with radiation to destroy or at least confuse their homing system. These had distinctive wingtips, and the reason was that in late wind tunnel testing they identified lateral instability. To address this, they would have needed to have introduced a 5-degree dihedral, which is a slight angle upwards, in the wings, but this would then require a redesign of the whole wing, so they just compensated by just angling up the wingtips by 12 degrees. Here's the exhaust of the two J-79s, and while they did make this a very fast aircraft, it was large and heavy, leading to high fuel consumption that would make my old supercharged Ford XR8 blush. This here is a Douglas RB-66B, which was a photo reconnaissance version of the B-66, which was also a light bomber. They had electronic countermeasure equipment fitted and were incredibly important during strikes against the North Vietnamese, as they could detect enemy radar emissions and jam their signals, thus protecting other US aircraft. They were also designed to operate in bad weather and would have a pathfinding role guiding F-4 and F-105s on bombing missions to the target. Spinning around, and we get a great view of this beautiful Connie from earlier, and here we have the General Dynamics F-111A, nicknamed the Aardvark because of that long nose. It was for a reason though, because it had a large and high-tech radar system used for terrain following, which was like cruise control, where the pilots could set an altitude and roughness of the system, and it would maintain that, allowing the pilot to essentially fly blind. If there was a mountain coming up, this would detect it and rapidly lift the aircraft's nose. It had a unique ejection pod where the two pilots would eject in one large capsule rather than in individual chairs, and this was because it was capable of such high speeds that a human would need to be protected from the wind. Another fascinating design feature was the variable geometry wings, where they would stick out for low speed lift and move back for supersonic speed. They could even overlap the rear tailplane to reduce the wingspan and allow more to be stored close together. The design was plagued with delays, but it was extremely effective when it eventually arrived and loved by the Americans as well as the Aussies, who retired their C models in 2010. This is a LTV A-7D Corsair II subsonic light attack aircraft to replace the Sky Raiders. It was derived from the F-8 Crusader, but is smaller, simpler and easy to build and restricted to subsonic speed. The unique underside-ish air intake allowed for a narrower fuselage, although it did limit room for the radar above it, and that intake design wasn't used with many other aircraft. These came with turbofan engines, which were dramatically more efficient than the turbojets that came before it. In fact, it was said that this would consume 1/6 of the F-100's fuel at the same thrust. It was the fairly horrific fuel consumption of the early jets that held them back and probably led to the prop-driven Sky Raider remaining in service for so long. The Air Force used them primarily in a close air support role, where it was known for its accurate weapons delivery due to the advanced navigation and weapons delivery system. 459 of these D models, which came with more powerful engines over the standard Navy version, were delivered to the USAF and were used by the National Guard and then retired in the early 1990s. Next up, we have the Soviet-made S-75, or SA-2 according to its NATO name, surface-to-air missile. These were one of the most widely used air defense systems and first deployed in 1957. Its first shootdown was in 1959 when it took down a Taiwanese Martin RB-57D Canberra over China at 65,000 feet. The kill was credited to Chinese fighters to keep the program a secret. These were also used successfully against U-2 spy planes over the Soviet Union and Cuba, as well as extensive and successful use by the North Vietnamese forces during the Vietnam War. These systems became such a problem during the Vietnam War that they led to the use of these F-105 Thunder Chiefs in a wild weasel role. They would carry anti-radiation missiles and fly ahead of the main attack group to tempt the adversaries to turn their radar systems on, and then fire one of those anti-radiation missiles at them. They would also carry electronic countermeasure pods, which were later installed internally to help deflect incoming missiles by blasting them with radiation and damaging their homing systems. After dodging the missile, the F-105 would then launch missiles, bombs and/or bullets at the base of the SAM missile's white smoky tail. Because they feared the American anti-radiation missiles, they would often just turn off the radars, thus allowing other American aircraft to arrive unannounced. You may recall that just a few minutes ago I showed you this single-seat F-105, and this is the two-seater version used as a trainer, and the guy in the back would manage all of the SAM suppression jobs. As you can see, this is quite a large jet considering it had a single engine, and it was eventually replaced in the Wild Weasel role by the two-engine F-4G Advanced Wild Weasel you'll see shortly. And here is one of the many aircraft that these jets would be protecting, the Boeing B-52 Stratofortress that I mentioned earlier. There is a separate video on my channel where I crawl through one of those, and I'll link to that below. It's really interesting comparing the size of the weapons bay to other bombers, including the B-17 and B-29s in my videos around those, and even the B-36's massive bomb bay. These 8-engine behemoths first flew in 1952 and will continue to fly after 2050, which means they'll be in service for an incredible 100 years. There is currently a major upgrade program underway. One of the changes are newer jet engines, the Rolls-Royce BR700s, which will be assembled in the United States and currently used on a few private jets and the Boeing 717 airliner, and they'll continue to use 8 of them. This one here is a B-52D model, which interestingly you'll notice that it has a completely clean chin, unlike later models that had 2 bulges for the infrared and video cameras. Unsurprisingly, this was actually faster because there was a lot less drag, and the newer model, designated B-52J, is actually reverting back to these smooth chins, as they have even more advanced equipment not requiring the big additional bulges. Thanks for watching part 1, and now grab a glass of water and check out the second part where we explore the Cold War, modern research and developmental aircraft, space, presidential aircraft, and several intercontinental ballistic missiles. And don't forget to give the video a thumbs up and let me know which aircraft in this video you found the most interesting.